Hey guys, tonight I want to start with a page you've read right past, maybe 100 times, without ever seeing what was sitting on it. You think you know every person in the Little House books, 8 volumes, every wagon, every blizzard, every fiddle tune by the fire. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote her family so completely that millions of people can name her dog before they can name their own great-grandfather. But there is one man who gets a single evening in all of those thousands of pages. He arrives without warning, he sits at the table, he tells one story by lamplight, and then he walks out of the books forever. A small, quiet man, soft voice, mild eyes. The kind of relative you'd forget was in the room. In these happy golden years, Pa turns to him and asks, politely the way you ask a man who seems like he's never been anywhere, "So this is your first trip west?" And the quiet man answers, in that level voice of his, "Oh no, I was with the first white men that ever laid eyes on the Black Hills." The table goes still. The story he tells that night takes up one chapter. Laura wrote it down years later the way she heard it. An adventure, a campfire tale, something wonderful that happened to Uncle Tom once. Here is what the book does not tell you. The expedition that Quiet Man joined was a federal crime. The land he walked into was guaranteed, by signed treaty, by the word of the United States government, to the Lakota Sioux, forever. And the general commanding the United States Army on the plains had already issued written orders about men exactly like him. Not orders to turn them around, not orders to find them, orders to burn their wagons, destroy their supplies, arrest their leaders and hold them in military custody. The man at that supper table was Thomas Lewis Quiner, Ma Ingalls' baby brother, Laura's own uncle, Carolyn Quiner's blood. And in the winter of 1874, while his sister was surviving grasshopper plagues in a half-finished house, Tom Quiner was hiding inside a log stockade in the most forbidden place in America, with cavalry patrols hunting the hills for him, sworn to put his whole outfit to the torch. 26 men, 1 woman, 1 9-year-old boy, 6 wagons with a lie painted on the canvas. What they did that winter helped crack open a chain of events that would swallow the Black Hills, destroy a treaty, ignite a war, and put George Armstrong Custer on a hillside in Montana he would never walk down from. The bill for that winter is still unpaid. It is sitting in a federal account right now, roughly $2 billion that a nation refuses to touch. And Laura turned it into a bedtime story. Before we walk into this one, drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read them, and I like knowing where everyone is lying awake. Tell me if you ever noticed Uncle Tom in the books, even once, and if you're new here, subscribe. These long nights go easier when you don't have to find your way back to this fire alone. Leave the lamp low, get comfortable. Because the story of the quiet man at the table is one of the strangest things the frontier ever produced. A man who never raised his voice, walking point on one of the most reckless gambles in American history, and then going home and never making $1 off any of it. Here's the road we're walking tonight. A drowned father and a hungry childhood in Wisconsin. A brother lost to the bloodiest weekend America had yet seen. The logging camps that turned a soft-spoken boy into the kind of man expeditions get built around. A national crash, a general's telegram about gold, and a newspaper advertisement looking for men who could handle, in its own words, a gun and an axe. Then the journey. 6 wagons sneaking 400 miles through winter with the cavalry hunting them. A fort built by hand on forbidden ground. A betrayal in brass buttons. A war that killed the most famous soldier in America. A supper table in Smet. And at the very end, a courtroom in 1980, and a number with so many zeros in it that you'll want to be lying down when it arrives, which conveniently you are. It begins with water, remember that. It begins with water. And 60 years later it will end with water too. The schooner smelled of wet rope and cold pine. November on Lake Michigan is not a season. It's a sentence. The water turns the colour of gunmetal. The wind comes down from Canada with nothing to slow it, and the sailors who worked those lakes had a saying that November pays for the whole easy summer. On November 10th, 1845, in the Straits of Mackinac, that narrow throat of water where Lake Michigan and Lake Huron grind against each other, a trading schooner called the Ocean went down, and a man named Henry Newcomb Quiner went down with her. Henry was a trader, a father. 7 children carried his name back in Brookfield Township, Wisconsin, and the youngest of them, a boy called Thomas Lewis Quiner, born just the year before on November 23rd, 1844. Do the arithmetic on that. Tom Quiner was around 1 year old when the lake took his father. He would never hold a single memory of the man. Not a voice, not a face, nothing. His sister Carolyn, the girl who would grow up to be Ma Ingalls, the calm centre of the most famous pioneer family in American literature, was 5. Old enough to remember. Old enough to understand what it meant when the weeks passed and the wagon never came up the track. And here is where the story of the Quiner family stops being a sad anecdote and becomes a machine. Because Henry Quiner didn't just leave behind grief. He left behind a widow named Charlotte with a house full of children on the edge of settled country, in an age with no insurance, no pension, no safety net of any kind. The frontier had exactly one welfare program, and it was called Relatives. Charlotte Quiner moved the family to Jefferson County, Wisconsin. She held those children together through winters that the family stories only describe in fragments, and the fragments are enough. Cornbread when there was corn, less when there wasn't. The older accounts of those years describe a family that came so close to the edge that the children learned to treat hunger as a normal house guest. Carolyn learned to be careful, permanently, structurally careful. And if you've ever wondered why Ma Ingalls, in book after book, flinches at debt and risk and her husband's westward itch, you're looking at the answer. That caution wasn't a personality, it was a scar. But Tom learned something different. Carolyn was 5 when the bottom fell out, so she remembered the before. She spent her whole life trying to rebuild it. Order, neatness, a respectable house, nothing owed to anyone. Tom never had a before. He was an infant. The hard years weren't a fall from anything. They were simply the world, the only one he'd ever known. A child like that doesn't grow up careful. A child like that grows up with nothing to compare loss against. And the record of his life suggests he grew up quiet, capable with his hands, and strangely, completely unafraid of the kind of risk that made his sister's blood run cold. Keep those 2 children side by side in your mind tonight. The careful sister, the fearless baby brother, the same dead father, the same cold kitchen. 2 opposite answers to it. In 30 years, one of them will be guarding a flour barrel through a Minnesota grasshopper plague, counting every cup. The other will be crouched behind a log wall on stolen sacred ground, listening for cavalry, with a pan of illegal gold dust by his boots. Same family, same lake at the start of it. In 1849, when Tom was 4, his mother remarried a farmer named Frederick Holbrook. The household steadied. There was food, a stepfather, eventually a new baby sister, Charlotte, called Lottie. The crisis years ended. But the shape they pressed into those children never did. The Quiners closed around each other like a fist. They worked each other's land. They married into the same families, and one family in particular, a clan of music-playing, restless-footed neighbours named Ingalls. The lake had taken one man from them. It was not finished with the Quiner men, not yet. The water that opens this story has 2 more appointments to keep, one with a battlefield hospital, and one, much later, with a river in Oregon that Tom Quiner has never heard of and will never leave. But before any of that, 2 families on the Oconomowoc River are about to braid themselves together so tightly that the children they produce will share more blood than the law has words for. And that braid is how a quiet logger ends up at Ma Ingalls' supper table, with the United States Army somewhere in his past, and a story Laura will spend the rest of her life softening. Poor families on the frontier didn't choose their friends, they chose their allies. Through the 1850s, 2 households worked the country around Concord, Wisconsin, close enough to share harvest labour, close enough to share a fiddle on winter nights. On one side, the Quiners, fatherless, careful, held together by Charlotte's spine and the older boy's wages. On the other, the Ingalls clan, Lansford and Laura Ingalls and their 9 living children, a family with music in it and restlessness, and never quite enough money to sit still. The 2 houses traded work. Then they traded letters. Then they started trading children. In 1859, Henry Quiner, Tom's older brother, married Polly Ingalls. A few months later, on the first day of February 1860, a quiet, dark-haired schoolteacher named Caroline Quiner stood up in Concord and married Polly's brother, a green-eyed young man with a fiddle and big plans named Charles Philip Ingalls. And in 1861, Peter Ingalls closed the triangle and married Eliza Quiner. 3 weddings, 2 families. By the end of it, the Quiners and the Ingalls weren't neighbours anymore. They were a single organism with 2 last names. The children of those marriages would be double cousins, sharing as much blood as half-siblings. When this clan moved, it moved in convoys. When it failed a harvest, it starved in company. And the youngest Quiner boy watched all of it from the edge of the room. Tom was 15 when Caroline married Charles. Too young to matter at the weddings, too old to be petted. The youngest brother in a family like that occupies a strange position. Every decision is made above his head. Every farm has an owner before he's grown. Every path is walked smooth before he gets to it. The records from those years give us almost nothing of Tom directly, but they give us one thing, and it's worth stopping for. October the 6th, 1861. Caroline, newly married, writing to her sister Martha, adds a line about their youngest brother. "Thomas is at home and just as good a boy as ever," she writes. "He said last night he would give so much to see you." Read that again. That is the entire surviving portrait of Tom Quiner at 16. Good, quiet, homesick for a sister who'd moved away, a boy who said his soft things out loud at night to family and nowhere else. Hold on to that sentence, because that is the same person who, 13 years later, walks past the United States Army into land where the punishment on the books was burned wagons and a military cell. And the distance between those 2 facts is the entire mystery of this man's life. How does just as good a boy as ever become the kind of man a cavalry column rides out to hunt? The answer starts 6 months after Caroline mailed that letter. Because by October of 1861, when she wrote it, the country was already on fire. And the fire was coming for the Quiner brothers in order, oldest first. Joseph had already enlisted. 23,000 men. That's the casualty count from 2 days of fighting at a Tennessee river landing in April of 1862. More American dead and wounded than the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the war with Mexico had produced combined. One battle, one spring weekend. The newspapers needed a name for the thing, and they reached for the little log church at the centre of the field, Shiloh. It means place of peace. Joseph Quiner was there, Tom's oldest brother, the one who'd stepped nearest to the father-shaped hole in the family, the one who'd been a grown man working wages when Tom was still learning to walk. He'd gone south with the 16th Wisconsin Infantry, Company B, one of the thousands of quiet farm county men who filled the Union's western armies. On the first morning of the battle, the Confederate attack came out of the woods before breakfast and drove the Union lines back toward the Tennessee River, toward the steamboat landing the soldiers called Pittsburgh Landing. The fighting chewed through peach orchards and sunken roads. Men fired at smoke. Whole regiments from Wisconsin and Iowa and Illinois, boys who had never heard a shot fired in anger, stood in the open and learned, in minutes, what the next 3 years of the war were going to be. Somewhere in that wreckage, Joseph Quiner went down, wounded badly. The record tells us he didn't die on the field. He died the slower way of his wounds in the weeks that followed. And you need to understand what died of his wounds meant in the spring of 1862, because it is its own quiet horror, separate from the battle. Military medicine at Shiloh was a man with a saw and a bucket working by lantern light, years before anyone washed their hands on purpose. The wounded lay in the April rain along the riverbank by the thousand, waiting for steamboats. If the bleeding didn't take you, the infections came, and the hospitals, when you reached one, were warehouses of gangrene and fever, where the orderlies learned to read a wound's smell the way farmers read sky. That was the corridor Joseph Quiner entered when he fell, and it took him weeks to walk it to the end. Somewhere far north, his family got to do their waiting in installments. A name in a casualty column, then a letter, then the letter. The army recorded its arithmetic and moved the decimal. One private died of wounds. The Quiners recorded theirs in the only ledger poor families keep. One more man gone, one more woman doing sums at a kitchen table. Picture what that meant back in Wisconsin. No telegram to the family door. That's not how it worked for privates. News like that travelled by newspaper casualty list, by a letter from a comrade, by rumour that arrived before the facts and hung in the house for days while Charlotte and the sisters waited to learn which version was true. Charlotte Quiner had now lost a husband to the lake and a son to the war. Carolyn, Ma, was 22, a new wife in a little frame house, and the brother who had helped feed her through the starving years was gone. If you've watched our other nights with this family, you already know Caroline never wrote her grief down. She folded it. She put it away where it couldn't embarrass anyone. Decades later, her daughter would build 8 books out of this family and barely whisper that any of this had happened at all. And Tom? Tom was 17 the spring Shiloh took Joseph. Old enough to read the casualty lists. Old enough to understand exactly what war paid a poor family for its men. And precisely 17 months too young to have been standing in that peach orchard himself. Here's a detail worth sitting with. The war went on for 3 more years. Tom turned 18, 19, 20. The drafts came and the bounties rose, and there is no record that Tom Quiner ever wore a uniform. His brother Henry's family, the Ingalls boys, cousins, neighbours. The war reached into nearly every house around them. James Ingalls served. George Ingalls, Pa's younger brother, marched off with a drum at 14 and came home with something broken in him that the family only ever called wildness. But the youngest Quiner stayed out. Whether the lot passed him over, whether the family that had already given a father and a son simply couldn't spare its last boy, whether Tom himself looked at what came home from places like Shiloh and made his own arithmetic, the documents don't say. What the documents do say is this. When Tom Quiner finally left home, he didn't go south toward the guns or west toward the land booms. He went north, into the pines, into the one industry in America that killed men at rates a soldier might have respected, and paid them in cash for the privilege. The lake had taken his father. The war had taken his brother. The family pattern was set, and a betting man would have given you long odds on the youngest Quiner dying somewhere loud, somewhere wet, somewhere far from a churchyard. Every one of those odds will eventually be called in, but not for 40 years, and not before the quiet boy from Concord walks into the middle of the biggest land theft in American history entirely on purpose, with an axe over his shoulder. First, he had to learn the axe. What was America actually built out of in those years after the war? Not steel, not yet. Wood. White pine, mostly. Straight, light. Soft enough to work fast, strong enough to hold a roof. Chicago was wood. Minneapolis was wood. Every farmhouse, sidewalk, grain elevator, church, and coffin between the Mississippi and the mountains was wood, and an astonishing share of it came out of one green corner of the map, the pineries of northern Wisconsin, along the Chippewa River and its branches, where the trees stood 200 feet tall and 4 men holding hands couldn't wring the trunks. That's where Tom Quiner went. Eau Claire, Wisconsin, a sawmill town on the Chippewa, loud as a battle and twice as profitable. By the time Tom arrived in his 20s, the valley around it was cutting timber on a scale nobody had ever seen, and it needed men, not talkers, not dreamers. It needed men who could work cold, work careful, and not panic when the work tried to kill them. Understand what logging meant in the 1860s and 70s, because the postcard version lies to you. The work ran through the winter, on purpose. You cut when the ground froze, because only ice roads could carry that much weight. Crews lived in log camps from November to April. 1 stove, 40 men, bunks stacked like cordwood, socks steaming on lines overhead, the smell of wet wool and tobacco and pork grease soaked into everything. You were up before light. You swung an axe or dragged a crosscut saw until dark. The cold split boot leather. The trees, when they came down wrong, did not give a man time to scream. And then came spring, and the real lottery, the river drive. Millions of board feet of logs shoved into the thaw-swollen Chippewa, and crews of men riding them downstream, actually standing on moving logs in ice water, breaking jams with peavies and pry bars. When a jam broke wrong, it went off like a dam failing. The drive killed men every single year. The camps had a phrase for the dead that tells you everything about the industry's bookkeeping. They fed the river. The lake had taken Tom's father. Now Tom went to work every spring on water that ate men for a living. But here's the thing the record makes quietly clear. Tom Quiner was good at this. He was not a big man. Laura would later remember her uncle as small and soft-spoken, and the camps were full of giants with loud mouths. Didn't matter. Logging, like war, sorts men fast, and the sorting has nothing to do with volume. The men who lasted were the ones who watched everything. The lean of a trunk, the sound of ice, the grey in the sky upriver. Quiet men, careful men, men whose nerves ran cold instead of hot. Tom lasted. More than lasted. Years later, the lumber companies of the valley would trust him to boss crews. The homesick boy from Caroline's letter had found the one country in America where being quiet was a rank. And the camps gave him something else, something that matters enormously for where this story is going. They taught him how a crew of strangers becomes an organism. 40 men in one bunkhouse from first frost to thaw. You learn fast who hoards, who shirks, who panics, who steadies. You learn that a winter outfit lives or dies on its cook, its tools, and the 2 or 3 men everyone silently checks with before believing anything. The pineries were running every winter, the exact experiment the Gordon Party would need. Lock a small company of armed, bored, ambitious men in a frozen box for 5 months and see what holds them together. Tom Quiner did that experiment a dozen times before anyone ever said the words Black Hills to him. He knew precisely what he'd be walking into, which makes him maybe the only man on that famous wagon train who did. And the wages, modest as they were, Tom didn't drink them or gamble them like half the camp did every spring. The land records show us exactly where they went. In the late 1860s, his brother Henry and his brother-in-law Charles Ingalls bought farmland down in Chariton County, Missouri. 6 months later, Tom bought a quarter section right beside them, 160 acres of his own, paid for with pinery money. Henry let his Missouri land go. Charles let his go. Charles, God love him, let every piece of land he ever touched go. Tom held his for 13 years. Sit with that contrast for a second, because the books trained us all backwards. Charles Ingalls, Paha, the hero, the dreamer, bounced off 4 states in those same years, chasing land he couldn't keep, hauling Caroline and the girls behind him from Wisconsin to Kansas to Wisconsin again to Minnesota. The quiet little brother-in-law in the logging camps quietly outowned him. By 1873, Tom Quiner was 28 years old. Steady work, land in 2 states, a surviving family braided around him, Caroline out west with Charles, Henry farming, Eliza married to Peter Ingalls, his mother safe with Holbrook, little Lottie grown. He had clawed the Quiner name back from the lake and the war and the hungry years, one frozen winter at a time. Every dollar of it was about to be put at risk, not by weather, not by water, but by a banker in Philadelphia that Tom Quiner had never met, and a yellow metal he had never seen. Then came the autumn that broke the country. September 18th, 1873, a Thursday morning. The most respected investment house in America, J. Cook and Company, the bank that had financed the Union war effort itself, locked its doors in Philadelphia. It had gambled everything on a railroad to the Pacific, the Northern Pacific, and the gamble had failed. By noon, the panic was eating Wall Street. Within days, the New York Stock Exchange did something it had never done in its history. It simply closed. We call what followed the Panic of 1873, which is a tidy little name for what was, for the people inside it, the end of the world's certainty. Banks died by the dozen. Railroads, half-built, debt-soaked, stopped laying track from one day to the next. And when the railroad stopped, the thing they were built from stopped too. Lumber. Demand out of the pineries collapsed. Camps cut crews. Mills cut shifts, then wages, then men. The Chippewa Valley, which had spent a decade hiring anyone with two hands, started turning experienced loggers out into a country where there was suddenly no work at all. Not east, not south, nowhere. Within a year, whole columns of unemployed men were drifting the roads of the Midwest. The newspapers called it the Great Depression, the first time those words were ever used about America. Now widen the lens and look west, because the disaster was running on two tracks at once. Out on the plains, where Tom's sister Caroline was unpacking yet another wagon, the sky itself turned against the settlers. Beginning in 1873 and worsening through the decade, clouds of Rocky Mountain locusts, grasshoppers the settlers called them, came down on the wheat country like weather. Not a swarm, a sky. They came in bodies so thick they dimmed the sun, and they ate everything. Crops to the dirt, leather harness, fence posts, the wool off live sheep, the clothes off a line. Then they laid eggs in the ruined fields and died, and the next summer the eggs hatched, and it happened again. Charles and Caroline Ingalls walked their family straight into the middle of that. In 1874 they settled on Plum Creek in Minnesota, wheat country, the famous dugout. The banks Laura would one day make beautiful. The wheat came up tall, the debt was supposed to be temporary, and the sky came down and ate the crop, and with it, every plan the family had. So, hold the whole picture now, the way almost nobody held it at the time. The banks broken in the east, the wages dead in the pineries, the sky eating the farms in the west. Hundreds of thousands of men, loggers, farmers, veterans, immigrants, standing in the wreckage of the third or fourth fresh start of their lives, with winter always coming. Into that country, in the summer of 1874, the United States Army sent George Armstrong Custer into the Black Hills. On paper, the expedition was reconnaissance, a survey for a future fort. 1,000 soldiers, more than 100 wagons, cannon, a 16-piece band playing marches across the grass, scientists, newspapermen, and riding along very much not by accident, 2 practical miners. There was just one problem with all of it. The Black Hills weren't America's to survey. 6 years earlier, in 1868, the United States had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and this wasn't some frontier handshake. The Lakota under Red Cloud had just fought the US Army to a standstill. This was a treaty the Indians had won. Its terms were blunt. The Black Hills, Paha Sapa, the heart of everything, the place the Lakota went to seek visions and bury their dead, sat inside the Great Sioux Reservation, and the treaty's own words promised that no white person would ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in that territory, ever. The paper carried the signature of the United States of America. Custer's column rolled through it anyway, and on French Creek in late July of 1874, the miners panned out what they were really there to find. Gold. Trace amounts, honestly. Specks and flakes. It didn't matter. Custer sent a scout named Charlie Reynolds, riding alone across 100 miles of hostile country, with a dispatch in his saddlebag, and when that dispatch hit the telegraph wires, the press did the rest. By August, newspapers across a ruined, jobless, locust-eaten country were printing the sentence that lit the fuse. There was gold in the Black Hills from the grassroots down. From the grassroots down. To a man who'd lost his wages in the crash, that sentence didn't read like geology. It read like the door of a jail swinging open. The government understood instantly what it had done. The Army's commanders knew a stampede was coming, and knew every prospector who crossed that line was a match dropped on a treaty soaked in kerosene. So the order went out, and I want you to hear the actual order, because the books never put it next to Uncle Tom's cheerful dinner story, and it belongs there. From Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan to the commander at St. Paul, regarding any expedition organizing at Sioux City to enter the Black Hills. You are hereby directed to use the force at your command to burn the wagon trains, destroy the outfits, and arrest the leaders, confining them at the nearest military post in the Indian country. Should they succeed in reaching the interior, you are directed to send such force of cavalry in pursuit as will accomplish the purposes above named. Burn the wagons, destroy the outfits, arrest the leaders, pursue them with cavalry into the interior if they slip through. That was the law of the land in the autumn of 1874. That was what the United States Army was promising to do to any civilian who set foot in the Black Hills. And in Sioux City, Iowa, that same autumn, a newspaper editor named Charles Collins and a mining man named T.H. Russell were quietly working out how to do it anyway. Their recruiting notice travelled through the papers and on handbills, looking for a particular kind of man, experienced, it said, with a gun and an axe, and carrying cash for his own expenses. 11,000 men by that August had signalled they wanted to go. The army leaned on the organisers. Collins and Russell publicly announced the whole scheme was cancelled, called the thing off in the open for everyone to see. That announcement was a screen. Behind it they were hand-picking a small party. Quiet men, capable men, men who could walk 400 miles into winter, dodge the cavalry of their own country, build a fort in hostile territory with hand tools, and keep their mouths shut about all of it. Men experienced with a gun and an axe. Up in the Chippewa Valley, 8 loggers signed on together, friends and workmates from the camps around Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls, Dempster, Lamb, Logan, the 2 Dans, both named MacDonald, one called Red and one called Black, Angus MacDonald, James Power, and one small, soft-spoken crew boss, 29 years old, with a dead father in Lake Michigan, a dead brother under Tennessee Clay, a sister out on the Grasshopper Plains, and apparently not one nerve in his whole quiet body. The recruiters wanted gun, axe, and cash. Tom Quiner had all 3. Every place in this story so far has been a price tag. This one is a prayer. Before the wagons roll, stop and actually look at the thing everyone in 1874 was scheming toward. Because if you only ever see the Black Hills through a miner's eyes, the rest of tonight is just logistics. You have to know what was actually being broken into. Come up out of the plains from any direction, and you'll understand the name. After hundreds of miles of grass, flat, bright, treeless, a country with no ceiling, a dark mass lifts off the western horizon like a storm that forgot to move. Get closer, and the darkness resolves into pine, mountains, real ones, furred black with ponderosa from foot to crown, rising 4,000 feet off the prairie floor. An island, 60 miles by 100 of everything the plains are not. Cold creeks, deep timber, sheltered valleys, elk and deer wintering thick in the draws, lodge poles for the cutting, granite spires holding snow. To the Lakota, this was not scenery, and calling it sacred barely starts the explanation. One of their names for the hills translates roughly as the heart of everything that is. Lakota tradition holds that the people themselves first came into this world from under these mountains, through the breathing mouth of what we now call Wind Cave, where the underground exhales. The hills were where you went to fast and cry for a vision on the high points, where bands rode in to cut lodge poles and winter out of the wind, where the dead were carried. The plains were where the Lakota lived. Paha Sapa was why. And here is the part your history class probably skipped. As of 1874, all of it, every creek Custer's miners panned, every pine Tom Quiner would fell, belonged to the Lakota not just by their own reckoning, but by the United States reckoning. On paper, twice over. You need to know how that paper got signed, because it's the only time in this whole century the story runs the other direction. In the 1860s, the government had tried exactly what it would try again in our story. It punched a road through Lakota country, the Bozeman Trail to the Montana goldfields, and built forts to guard it. The Lakota under Red Cloud, with Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, answered with 2 years of relentless war. In December of 1866, outside Fort Phil Kearny, they wiped out Captain William Fetterman and every one of his 80 men, At that time, the worst defeat the army had ever suffered on the plains. The forts became starving, besieged islands, and in 1868 the United States did something it almost never did in its entire frontier history. It gave up. The army abandoned the Bozeman forts, Red Cloud's people burned them to the grass, and the government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie on the victors' terms. The treaty drew the Great Sioux Reservation across everything west of the Missouri in what's now South Dakota, Black Hill's dead center, and wrote the guarantee in language a child could pass, set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux. No unauthorized white person shall ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in the territory, and no future sale of any of it would count unless 3/4 of all adult Lakota men signed. Ever. Absolute. 3/4. Those words are in the document. Red Cloud had not negotiated a lease. He had won a border. 6 years. That's how long the border held. 6 years. Until a gold-starved depression and a 1,000-man survey column and a newspaper sentence about grassroots dissolved it like sugar in rain. When Custer's wagon train cut its trail into the hills in the summer of '74, the Lakota watched it go in, and they gave that scar across their heartland a name that says everything tonight's story needs you to carry forward. They called it the Thieves' Road. Remember that name. In a few minutes, in the December dark, a small party of trespassers with a lie painted on their wagon canvas is going to strike a set of ruts in the snow south of Bear Butte and follow the Thieves' Road the rest of the way in. Among them, a quiet logger from Wisconsin carrying his sister's family's same stubborn hope that somewhere out there was finally a piece of ground that would pay a poor man back. The tragedy of 1874, the engine of everything still to come, the wars and the courtrooms and the $2 billion, is that both of those things were true at once. To Tom Quiner, the Black Hills were the last door out of a ruined decade. To the Lakota, they were the first home there had ever been. Same mountains, same winter. Two meanings that could not both survive. Only one of them had the wagons. Somebody painted the lie right on the canvas. 6 wagons stood loaded on the west bank of the Missouri in the first week of October 1874, and along one white wagon cover, in letters big enough to read from a passing patrol, ran the words O'Neill's Colony. O'Neill was a real settlement in Nebraska, a safe, legal, respectable destination off to the southwest. Any soldier, any agency man, any stranger on the trail who asked would get the same easy answer. Just settlers, friend, bound for the Elkhorn Valley. It was a costume. The wagons were pointed at the most forbidden ground in North America. They pulled out from Sioux City on October the 6th, 1874. 28 men at the start, 1 woman, and 1 9-year-old boy. A third of the men were practical miners who knew placer gold when they washed it. A third were the Wisconsin axemen, Tom Quiner among them, brought along for one job above all. When this party reached the Black Hills, it was going to have to build its own fort, fast, in winter, in the middle of a nation that had every right to kill them for being there. Leading them on the trail was John Gordon, a freighter who knew the country west of the river, and whose name would end up on the whole affair. And then there was the family, David Tallent, a lawyer down on his luck, his wife Annie, a schoolteacher, sharp-eyed in her 40s, who would one day write the only full memoir of this march, and their boy, Robert, 9 years old, riding into a war zone in a wagon with a lie painted on it. Whatever you end up thinking of these people, and tonight is not going to make it simple, hold that image. Somebody brought a child. The route was deliberately wrong. Instead of striking northwest toward the hills, the wagons crawled west across Nebraska, deep along the Niobrara River country, keeping the costume on, telling the O'Neill story at every chance meeting. And then, only when the settlements thinned out behind them, they bent north and crossed into Dakota territory like men wading into deep water. Now the country itself started charging admission. October on the high plains is a closing door. The party was moving at ox speed, 2 miles an hour on the good days, through country with no roads, no bridges, no resupply. Streams had to be forded, bluffs cut down with shovels so the wagons wouldn't somersault. Every gallon of water and pound of flour rationed against a map none of them had ever seen. Annie Tallent's shoes died somewhere out in that grass. She later wrote of walking on mile after mile with her feet wrapped in gunny sacking, a schoolteacher hiking into the Badlands in burlap. The days fell into the rhythm all long marches find. Up in the iron dark before dawn, because oxen yoke slow and daylight was the only currency that mattered. Walk, walk more. Nobody rode who could walk. The wagons were for flour and tools, not for people. Noon halt where there was water, and the endless frontier arithmetic at every stop. How much grass for the stock, how much daylight left, how many miles made. 8 on a kind day, fewer when the gullies argued. Then a cold camp or a small one. Supper off buffalo chip fires that burn fast and dirty. The stock staked close, and the first watch posted before the light was fully gone. Then do it again and again. For 11 weeks, through October's wind, November's first snows, December's real teeth, with a 9-year-old boy riding the tailgate watching the only world he'd known sink below the horizon behind him. And every man on that march carried the same quiet math Tom carried. Each day forward was a day deeper into a rest, and a day too far to easily get back. By November, the party was travelling part of the time by night and lying quiet in ravines by day. They knew what was looking for them, and I want to reset those stakes plainly, because the warm little dinner table version Laura heard erases them. This was not a wagon trip with a naughty secret. Sheridan's standing order was in force. Wagons burned, outfits destroyed, leaders jailed, and cavalry pursuit into the interior if they slipped through. Every man in that column had bet his entire net worth. The oxen, the tools, the winter provisions, all of it bought with his own cash, on not being seen. If a patrol crested the wrong ridge, Tom Quiner's pinery savings didn't get confiscated politely. They went up in a bonfire on the prairie, and he walked to a military stockade in irons. That was the good outcome. The other watchers on those ridgelines weren't bound by Sheridan's paperwork. This was Lakota country, not in the loose sense that all of it had once been, but by current signed, ratified law. The party crossed it like burglars crossing a dark house, cold camps, low fires. And the strange mercy of the whole march is what didn't happen. No war party ever hit them. Whether they were seen and let pass, whether winter kept the camps along the rivers, whether luck simply ran their way for 11 straight weeks, the record can't tell us. The miners called it fortune and kept rolling. The land collected payment anyway. Late in the march, a man named J.W. Brockett gave out, too sick to continue, and turned back east, alone, the long way they'd come. And near the crossing of the Bad River at the end of November, dysentery finished a California man named Moses Aarons. The party that had dodged the cavalry and the Lakota lost its first life to bad water and cold. They buried him out there, somewhere short of the hills he'd mortgaged himself to reach, and moved on the same day. 26 men left. The woman. The boy. On December 8th, south of where Sturgis stands today, the scouts cut a scar across the prairie. Wheel ruts, hundreds of them, months old, running southwest. Custer's expedition had dragged more than 100 wagons through this country in the summer, and the trail still lay on the land like a fresh wound. The outlaws turned onto the Thieves' Road and followed it in. 2 weeks later, December the 23rd, 1874, the wagons rolled to a stop in a snow-dusted valley on French Creek, near the very campsite where Custer's miners had first panned colour 5 months before. 78 days out of Sioux City, 635 miles. They had done it. They were standing, illegally, impossibly, in the middle of the Black Hills, the first civilian outfit to pull it off. It was 2 days before Christmas. It was beginning to snow in earnest. The nearest friendly door was 400 miles away. The United States Army did not know they existed, and the only thing between 28 souls and a Dakota winter was a stand of pine trees and 8 men from Eau Claire who knew what to do with them. Tom Quiner unlashed his axe. Fear, in the end, is a sound problem. Out in open country, fear is everything you can see coming. But inside a pine valley in winter, fear narrows down to the ears. The crack of a branch under snow load that might be a branch. The creek talking under its ice. The specific silence of 2 o'clock in the morning when the fire has burned down and somebody, every night in rotation, has to stand in the dark at the wall and just listen. The Gordon party solved its fear the only way it could. It built. The axemen laid it out beside French Creek, a square stockade 80 feet on a side. They dropped pines a foot thick, cut them to length, stood them shoulder to shoulder in a trench until the walls ran 10 feet high. Solid timber, no gaps, with log bastions jutting from the corners so riflemen could cover every face of every wall. Inside the square they raised cabins, 6 of them, maybe 7, the accounts disagree, chinked against the cold, and dug a well so that no siege could cut them off from water. Stop and picture the labour, deep snow, short days, green frozen timber, hand tools. The whole fortress went up in roughly 3 weeks. By the middle of January it stood finished, and the men inside, with a logger's sense of humour, named it Fort Defiance. Defiance of exactly whom was an open question. The walls were built with the Lakota in mind, but the only army anyone truly expected was their own. And then began the strangest stretch of Tom Quiner's life, a piece of time with almost no equal anywhere in the American story. For 2.5 months, 20-some people lived in a handmade wooden box in the dead centre of the most contested ground on the continent, and the world simply did not know they were alive. No mail, no telegraph. Nothing was heard from them anywhere until February. Back in Sioux City they were a rumour. In the treaty ledgers of the United States they were a crime that hadn't been discovered yet. In the Black Hills they were 20-odd hearts beating inside 80 feet of pine. They marked Christmas inside the walls with what they had, which, 2,000 miles from anyone who loved them, came down to a fire, full rations for once, and whatever singing 26 tired men and 1 schoolteacher could raise against that much dark. Let yourself stand a night watch with Tom before we move on, because this is the texture the dinner table version never carried. 2 in the morning on the bastion, January 20 below. The cold works through wool and buffalo coat like water through cloth. Above the walls, more stars than any town sky will ever show you again, hard and close. Below, the small sounds of the only outpost of the unauthorized world. An ox shifting, the creek muttering under its ice, a snore through cabin chinking, the well rope knocking once against its frame. And beyond the pickets, the whole dark weight of the hills, where every snapped branch had to be triaged in a heartbeat. Deer, snow load, wind, or a pony, or a patrol. The men filled the bunkhouse hours the way confined men always have. Cards, mending, arguments about nothing, plans spoken aloud over the fire until they sounded real. What they'd do with the money, the farms, the stores, the debts that were going to die screaming come summer. The boy, Robert, did his lessons. His mother saw to that, stockade or no stockade. And in the corner of the record, where he lived his whole life, the short logger from Eau Claire kept his watch and said almost nothing. A man, you start to suspect, who had been waiting since 1845 for the world to make sense, and found that it finally did out here, where the dangers at least had the manners to be visible. Then the light would come up grey over the palisade, and they went to work on the creek, because here is the part that made every frozen, terrified mile of it make sense. The gold was real, not Custer's specs. Real, payable colour. The miners chopped through creek ice and thawed gravel over fires and washed pan after pan, and French Creek paid them, gold and silver besides. The frost sank deeper through January and the digging got brutal, ground frozen like iron lid over the gravel, but the pans kept showing colour and the arithmetic in every man's head started running hot. One of the party, R.R. Whitney, put that arithmetic in a letter to his wife, and the sentence survives. I have set my pile at $150,000 before I leave the Black Hills, he wrote. I think it will take that to pay me for what I suffered to get into this country. $150,000 in 1875, north of $4 million in today's money. That's what these men now believed the Creek owed them. Not survival, not wages, fortunes. So, take the measure of the trap they had built for themselves, because it has a beautiful, terrible shape to it. The gold was real, but they were running out of everything else. Flour, salt, powder, boots. A camp can't eat gold dust, and the only way to resupply was for somebody to leave, to walk back out through 400 miles of winter and patrols, and every man who walked out was a man carrying the secret in his mouth. In February it broke open. The party sent men out with gold to buy supplies. Gordon himself went, and Ephraim Witcher with him, east to Sioux City, and on to Chicago and Cheyenne, where they did rather more than buy flour. They showed the gold. They told the story. Recruit more men, raise the stakes, come back strong. That was the plan, and the newspapers fell on it like starving dogs. The Gordon party, the outlaws who'd beaten the army into the hills, were suddenly famous. Proof, printed and telegraphed coast to coast, that the gold was real, and a man with nerve could simply go take it. Inside the stockade, the ones who stayed, Tom Quiner among them, kept panning and kept watch, while their secret rode the wires of an entire hungry nation. And others were leaving too, in twos and threes, men who'd had enough of frozen gravel, drifting out towards Sioux City, toward Fort Laramie, each one a loose thread off the same unravelling cloth. In the first week of March, 1875, two of those threads, two of their own messmates, men who had eaten from the same pots and stood the same freezing watches, walked through the gates of Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory, and into the offices of the United States Army. The army had been hunting this camp for weeks and finding nothing. Now it didn't need to hunt. It had guides, March 23, 1875. Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory. A column of the 2nd United States Cavalry forms up in the mud of early thaw and rides north. At its head is Captain John Mix, a career officer with a clear assignment and for the first time all winter an actual destination. The Black Hills had kept the Gordon camp hidden through 3 months of army frustration. Patrols had gone looking and come back with nothing. The hills are a maze of granite and pine, and a camp that doesn't want finding, in winter in 80 square miles of folded country, is a needle in God's own haystack. But Mix isn't guessing any more. Riding with the column, in borrowed soldiers' clothes, are J. Williams and Red Dan MacDonald, 2 men who spent that winter inside Fort Defiance, 2 men who know the trail because they helped break it, who know the gates because they helped hang them, who stood watch on those very walls against this very army. The men inside the stockade had spent the whole winter listening for an enemy. It never occurred to them to listen for friends. Try for a minute to stand where Tom Quiner is standing in the first week of April. The creek ice is rotting. The pans are still showing colour. The camp is thin. Most of the original party has drifted out by now. 16 men remain, plus Annie Tallent and the boy, and supplies are down to the kind of arithmetic where you count crackers. Everyone left inside is waiting on the same thing. Gordon coming back from the settlements with men and flour and powder. Every set of hooves that might be wind in the timber might also be him. One evening in early April riders do come. 4 of them, bold as brass, straight through into the stockade, no hail, no warning, and for one shining heartbeat the camp thinks the wait is over. Annie Tallent wrote the moment down years later, and her words are worth hearing exactly as she put them. At first sight they were thought to be the vanguard of our expected reinforcements, but upon a second look it was seen that 2 of our visitors were in military uniform, while in the other 2 we recognised the familiar faces of our quondam comrades, J. Williams and Dan MacDonald, who, as emissaries of Uncle Sam, had also donned soldiers' clothes. The blue coats and brass buttons betrayed their mission. The blue coats and brass buttons betrayed their mission. Reinforcements. That was the hope. What rode through the gate instead was the United States Army wearing the faces of their friends. There's a special quality to that kind of ending, and Annie's careful schoolteacher sentences can't quite bury it. Nobody stormed Fort Defiance. Nobody had to. The walls Tom and the Eau Claire men had raised against war parties and cavalry assaults were undone by 2 men who already knew where the latch was. If you want a working definition of the frontier, you could do worse than that. Every fort falls eventually, and it almost never falls to strangers. And here, credit where it's due. The moment everyone braced for simply didn't come. No torches, no irons. Captain Mix had Sheridan's standing orders behind him, the burn and arrest orders, and he chose to read them like a man rather than a memo. The miners offered no resistance. The historian Watson Parker, who studied this party closer than anyone, judged that they went peaceably for the simplest reason on earth. They were nearly out of food, and they knew it. Mix gave them a few days to pack what could be packed. It wasn't much. There weren't wagons and oxen enough left to haul a winter's worth of camp, so the heavy gear stayed. Picks, shovels, sluice lumber, the iron bones of their fortune, stacked and abandoned inside the walls. On or about April 9th, 1875, the Gordon party walked out of Fort Defiance under cavalry escort and did not look back, because looking back has never once helped anybody in this story. Behind them, the stockade stood empty in the snowmelt, gates open, cabins dark, well sweet, tools rusting where they leaned. The first white town in the Black Hills, abandoned whole, like a ship found floating with the kettle still warm. Within months, other hands would loot it down to the hinges. Within a year and a half, a starving army column would stagger out of the north and shelter in it. But we're not there yet. First, 16 men, 1 woman, and 1 boy have 421 miles to walk. Here's a question the textbooks never quite ask out loud. What happens when a government punishes people in a way that proves their crime was worth committing? The escort column reached Fort Laramie on April 18th, 1875. 9 days, 421 miles, the prisoners walking out the same hard country they'd snuck in through. And then came the moment the whole winter had been pointed at, the moment Sheridan's order existed for, the leaders confined at the nearest military post, the example made, the lesson taught. It didn't happen, not really. The Gordon Party members were processed and in short order released. The government had bigger fires lighting by the day, and a courtroom parade of frostbitten miners risked making the treaty question louder, not quieter. The miners scattered east, and when the core of the party reached Sioux City, the town that had launched them in secret welcomed them home in the wide open. As heroes. The local boosters toasted them. These were the men, the talk ran, who had prepared the way for opening up that country to settlement. Sioux City understood perfectly what it was celebrating. The town fancied itself the future gateway to the hills, and every returned trespasser was walking proof of the route, the gold, and the business to come. The same expedition that left town hidden behind a painted lie came home to handshakes and newspaper interviews. Men who 4 months earlier were subjects of a burn-on-sight order now had their accounts taken down admiringly, their gold dust weighed in public, their opinions on routes and provisions solicited like expert testimony. Some of them turned right around and started organising to go back. Now mark what the United States Army had actually accomplished, because it's one of the cleanest ironies on the frontier. The Army caught the trespassers, and by catching them, certified them. Every newspaper account of the removal carried the same payload between its lines. The party had lived in the hills for half a year. The Lakota had not wiped them out. The winter had not killed them, and the gold in their pokes was real enough to assay. The arrest was the advertisement. The Gordon party's capture did more recruiting for the Black Hills than the Gordon party ever could. The numbers tell you the rest. While Mix's troopers were escorting 16 people out of the hills that April, something like 3,000 other trespassers were already in them, scattered up the gulches, dodging the same patrols, multiplying every week. The Army spent the summer of 1875 running a revolving door, sweep miners out at gunpoint, watch them walk back in behind the next ridge. Soldiers escorted out men they'd already escorted out twice. Some patrols, the stories go, had begun to do the arithmetic themselves and look the other way. What exactly was the percentage in burning a poor man's wagon to defend a treaty their own general staff was already drafting around? Gordon himself proved both halves of the rule. He organised a fresh expedition and started north again that very year. And this time the Army did catch a wagon and train it was willing to make an example of. They intercepted his outfit and burned it, Sheridan's order finally executed in full. The bonfire Tom Quiner had been promised all winter delivered to somebody else's oxen. It changed nothing. The men kept coming. You cannot burn wagons faster than a depression builds them. And watch it for a moment from the ridge lines, because the people who actually owned the hills were watching all of it. The Lakota at the agencies saw the trespassers come out under escort in April and come back on their own in June. They saw the thieves' road harden from a scar into a highway. Their leaders had spent 6 years holding up their end of a treaty. The other side now enforced the way a tired bartender enforces closing time. Every gulch that filled with miners that summer was a clause dissolving in front of them, and the chiefs who counselled patience were running out of arguments, while the camps out on the unseeded grass, Sitting Bull's people, Crazy Horse's people, drew the only conclusion the evidence allowed. The paper was dead, and the wagons had killed it. So, Washington tried the other honest option, buying the unburnable thing. In the summer of 1875, the government summoned the Lakota leadership to talk price. The Allison Commission, sent out to negotiate the purchase or lease of the Black Hills. Thousands upon thousands of Lakota came into the council. It was one of the largest gatherings of the Plains nations ever assembled. Washington's men floated numbers, $6 million to buy, or an annual rent, and met a wall. For many in that vast camp, Paha Sapa was simply not a thing that converts to dollars. You may as well bid on the sky. Others named figures so high they were less a price than a refusal wearing numbers. The commission packed up and went home empty. And then it was November 3rd, 1875, and in the White House, far from any creek ice, the quiet men of the government held a quiet meeting. President Grant, his generals, his Indian Bureau. No new law came out of that room. No proclamation. Just an understanding recorded in the correspondence that followed. The standing orders barring miners from the Black Hills would remain on the books, and the army would stop enforcing them. Read that again. The law stays, the protection goes. The treaty becomes a piece of paper guarding a vault with the door propped open. Within weeks, the other shoe, an ultimatum went out across the winter plains that every Lakota band must abandon the unceded hunting grounds and report into the agencies by the last day of January 1876. Bands scattered across hundreds of frozen miles, many of whom never even received the message, all reclassified as hostile by a clerk's deadline they couldn't have met with wings. The trap the Gordon party helped spring was now fully built. The miners were in the hills by the thousand and staying. The purchase had failed, the deadline had passed. What came next? The country would learn to call the Great Sioux War. And the man whose name is stitched into its most famous hour, the golden-haired general whose expedition wrote the words "Gold" and "Black Hills" into the same telegram, had about 7 months left to live. Before the war takes the stage, give me 5 minutes for the schoolteacher. She earned them. Tonight's story exists. The dates, the quotes, the count of the cabins, the blue coats and brass buttons, largely because 3 documents survived. Captain Mix's official cavalry report, a memoir by party member David Aiken, and a book set down a quarter-century later by the only woman at Fort Defiance. If Tom Quiner is the quiet centre of this story, Annie Tallent is its court reporter, and her story deserves its own minute because it might be the strangest one in the whole party. She was no frontier girl. Annie Donna Tallent was a schoolteacher from New York State, educated, bookish, married to a lawyer whose luck had thinned, and she was in her late 40s when she climbed into that wagon in Sioux City. Late 40s in 1874 was not an age at which women walked 400 miles into the Badlands in winter. She did it anyway beside her husband David and their 9-year-old, and when her shoes gave out in the grass she wrapped her feet in gunny sacks and kept walking, and she noted later, with a schoolteacher's dry precision, exactly how much of that march she made on foot. The men of the party get the legend. Read the record, and it's Annie who supplies the spine. She cooked over buffalo chip fires in sleet. She wintered in the stockade with 20-odd armed men and kept a child alive and lessoned through it. And when the cavalry rode in that April evening, the description history remembers, the one we quoted, quondam comrades and brass buttons and all, is hers. The only professional observer at Fort Defiance turned out to be the one person nobody had recruited for her observations. Here's the detail that tells you who she was. After the army marched the party out, after the Badlands, the burlap, the arrest, Annie Tallent waited barely a year and went back. She returned to the hills in 1876 with the legal stampede, and she stayed for the rest of her life. First schoolteacher in the Black Hills, later a county superintendent of schools, a fixture of rapid city education, the grand old woman of the gold country. In 1899 she set it all down in the book this episode has leaned on all night, and in 1924, the year Caroline and Lily died, the people of the hills raised a granite monument to her at the site of the old stockade. And history, being history, didn't let it rest there. Annie's book carries a subtitle that reads very differently now than it did in 1899. The Black Hills, or the last hunting ground of the Dakotas. Even she knew, and printed it on the cover. Last hunting ground, named by the woman who helped open its first gate. In recent decades, as the Lakota half of this ledger has finally been weighed in public, her name has become an argument, honoured in granite by one generation, contested by the next, which is about the most honest monument a person from this story could possibly have. One schoolteacher walked into the hills with the outlaws and wrote the book. Another schoolteacher's daughter heard the story at a Lamplight table in Smet and wrote the other book. Between those two women, one documenting, one softening, sits everything America has ever done with this episode. But in the spring of 1875, all of that is still ahead. Right now, there's only a burned-out year, an emptied stockade, and out on the northern plains, a deadline ticking toward the last day of January. The men in Washington have stopped pretending. The men in the hills keep digging. And the bands out on the winter grass, the people whose land this entire story has been trespassing across, are about to be handed the consequences of every wagon, every pan, and every quiet man with an axe. Wars don't start, they accumulate. A treaty signed in 1868, a survey expedition in 1874 that had no business being where it was, a newspaper sentence about grassroots, 6 wagons with a lie on the canvas, a stockade, an arrest that worked like an advertisement, a failed purchase, a quiet meeting in November where a government agreed to stop enforcing its own word, a deadline no winter camp could meet. Stack them up, and by the spring of 1876 the stack had a shape, and the shape was war. The army took the field that year against the bands who had refused the agencies, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne who had gathered, in numbers nobody in uniform believed possible, around leaders whose names the whole world now knows. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. Columns converged from 3 directions, the maps in the generals' tents all agreeing the hostiles would scatter and run the way the textbook said. On the 25th of June, 1876, on a ridge above a river the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, and the maps called the Little Bighorn, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode the 7th Cavalry into the middle of the miscalculation of the century. The village below him held thousands, one of the largest gatherings of plains warriors ever assembled in one place. He split his regiment. He attacked. By the time the sun went down, Custer was dead on that hillside, and every man of the 5 companies who rode up there with him was dead around him. Upward of 260 of the 7th's men lost across the 2 days of fighting. The man whose expedition had carried the gold news out of the Black Hills lasted not quite 2 years past his own telegram. The news crossed the wires and hit the east in the very week of July 4th, 1876, landing in the middle of brass bands and bunting, the nation's 100th birthday party. The country had assembled to toast a century of itself, and the toast came back from Montana written in the casualty lists of its most famous regiment. The grief curdled to fury inside a week, and the fury went looking for a target it could actually reach. Sitting Bull was beyond the horizon. The Black Hills were not. That August, Congress did something with a clerk's tidiness that no cavalry charge could have managed. It attached a rider to the Indian Appropriations Bill. No further food or rations for the Lakota. Not 1 pound of the beef and flour the 1868 treaty itself had promised, until they gave up the Black Hills. The reservation system had already destroyed the buffalo economy. The treaty rations were what stood between the agency camps and starvation. Historians have a plain name for the manoeuvre. They call it the Sell or Starve Rider. In September, a commission went out to collect the signatures and collected them from chiefs watching their people's ribs show. Never mind that the 1868 treaty required the consent of 3/4 of all adult Lakota men for any land cession, and the commission came back with a fraction of that, perhaps a tenth. Paper is patient. On February 28, 1877, Congress passed the Act, and the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, the heart of everything, guaranteed forever just 9 years before, passed out of Lakota hands without a single legitimate signature's worth of consent. Keep one eye on that Act of Congress. It does not expire when this story ends. It is, in fact, still being argued about in our own lifetime. There is a $2 billion account sitting in the United States Treasury tonight because of that act. And the final chapter of this story is going to walk us into the 1980 courtroom that put it there. But spare the other eye for the gulches, because while the lawyers drafted, the hills filled up. Deadwood bloomed out of a gold strike in the northern hills in the spring of '76. Within months it was thousands strong, a plank and canvas city of saloons and sluices, entirely illegal, entirely unstoppable. That August, just under 2 weeks ahead of the Starve Them Out rider as it happens, a drifting gunman and sometime lawman named Wild Bill Hickok sat down at a poker table in Deadwood's No. 10 saloon with his back to the door for once, and a man named Jack McCall walked in behind him and shot him through the head. The cards in Hickok's hand, aces and eights, got a nickname that outlived everyone in the room. That's the Black Hills the Gordon party's winter had called into being, a place already minting its own legends, 18 months old. And in April of that same 1876, in the northern gulches, 4 prospectors staked a claim on a lead of this gold-bearing rock they called the Homestake. The following year, a hard-eyed mining capitalist out of California, George Hurst, came, looked, and bought it for $70,000. Mark that name and that number. Because here, finally, is the answer to the question Whitney's letter raised back in the stockade. The $150,000 every frozen man at Fort Defiance believed the hills owed him. The Homestake mine produced gold for the next 125 years, roughly 40 million ounces. It became one of the richest gold mines in the Western Hemisphere, the cornerstone of the Hearst fortune, the money that bought the mansions and the newspapers and bankrolled the empire of George's son, William Randolph Hearst, the man Citizen Kane is about. All of it pulled out of ground the United States had promised in writing no white man would ever touch. And the men who broke the hills open in the first place, the 26 who hauled 6 wagons through the Badlands in burlap-wrapped boots and built Fort Defiance with hand axes in a Dakota December, walk the list. Aaron's got a grave by the Bad River. Gordon got his wagons burned on the second try. Whitney never saw his pile. Annie Tallent got his sore feet, a famous memoir a quarter-century later, and a schoolteacher's salary. The fortunes their winter conjured out of French Creek went, as fortunes do, to the men who arrived afterward with capital and lawyers, to San Francisco drawing rooms, to a dynasty's ledgers. Tom Quiner got out with his life, his axe, and a story. Most men would have spent the next 50 years polishing that story in saloons, getting louder with every telling, growing it a gunfight or two. What Tom did with it instead is the strangest twist in this whole night, because what Tom did with it was, very nearly, nothing. Years after the Black Hills, a parcel travelled east from Dakota Territory to Wisconsin, and inside it was the skin of a swan. Hold that picture a moment. We'll learn it properly in a few minutes. Tom Quiner came out of Fort Defiance in the spring of 1875 and did the one thing no dime novel would ever permit its hero. He went back to work. Back north. Back to the timber. As far as the record shows, he never returned to the Black Hills. Not in the stampede of '76, when fortunes were lying in the gulches for the quick, not in the boom years after. The man who'd been first in simply declined to go back, and left no diary to tell us why. Why not go back? Every incentive pointed south. He had been there first. He knew the creeks. Men with half his knowledge were striking it rich in gulches he'd personally wintered beside. We can only weigh the possibilities the record allows. Maybe the stockade had shown him the true odds. He'd watched the best-positioned miners in America come out with sore feet and a story, while the talkers in the capital moved in behind. Maybe Lily happened, and the arithmetic of a wife changed the arithmetic of everything. Or maybe, simplest of all, he'd gone in the first time because 1874 had taken his wages and left him nothing to lose, and by 1876 the pinery had given him something to lose again. Desperation is a season. Tom's had ended. But the outline his life leaves in the documents is its own kind of answer. Tom signed on with the Laird, Norton Company of Winona, Minnesota, one of the giant lumber operations on the upper Mississippi, and stayed with them for more than 20 years. 20 years, one employer, in an industry where men drifted camp to camp like smoke. The companies made him a foreman, a man who bossed crews and was trusted with other men's lives and other men's money. Whatever the Black Hills had or hadn't paid him, the pinery paid him the thing his childhood never had: steadiness. And then, December 10th, 1879, at Winona, the quiet man got married. Her name was Lillian Graham Hill, Lily, Wisconsin-born, the daughter of Scots immigrants, and 21 years old to Tom's 35. The age gap reads strangely to us. On the frontier of 1879, it mostly read as a young woman marrying a proven man, a foreman with savings, a quarter section in Missouri, and not one whiff of saloon about him. The wedding came 5 years, almost to the week, after a younger Tom had stood in the snow on French Creek watching the walls of Fort Defiance go up. On March 13, 1881, in the hardtail of the most famous winter in this channel's history, Tom and Lily's first child was born, a daughter, Helen Marion Quiner. Now we can have the Swan. A year earlier, out in Dakota Territory, the Smet newspaper had run a small item. April 5, 1880, Kingsbury County News. C.P. Ingalls shot a large white swan on Silver Lake one day last week. It measured 6 feet 8 inches from tip to tip. C.P. Ingalls, Charles. Pa himself putting meat and feathers on the table the way he always had. And in Pioneer Girl, Laura's raw, unpublished memoir, the one that stayed in a drawer for 80-some years, Laura recorded what became of that bird. Pa salted and cured the skin and sent it away as a gift to Uncle Tom in Wisconsin, so that soft white swan skin could trim a coat for the new baby, for Helen. If you've read By the Shores of Silver Lake, you already know this swan. In the published book, the downline's a winter hood for baby Grace, and it's one of those small, glowing details that make the books feel like warm rooms. The real bird flew further. It flew 600 miles east in a parcel, from the brother-in-law who couldn't hold $1 to the brother-in-law who couldn't lose one. Pa's plain softness wrapped around the Black Hills outlaw's firstborn daughter. 2 families, 1 blood. The braid from Concord still holding 20 years and half a continent later. Tom and Lily's family grew the way frontier families did, which is to say, with the daughter grief always unlatched. 6 children, all told. Helen. Then Alice, born in the fall of 1882, who died small. Then a boy, Donald, who died small too. Then Lily and Josephine in 87, Dugald in 89, and much later, a last boy, John. 2 tiny graves before the family was 5 years old. The Quiners never seemed to have made any noise about it. That was not the family's way, and by now you know it. Carolyn folded her grief. Tom, every record suggests, did the same. The quiet in that family was never emptiness. It was load-bearing. So set the scene as 1883 closes. Tom Quiner, 39, foreman, husband, father, landowner, survivor of the strangest winter on the continent, and, to look at him, the single most unremarkable man on any street in Wisconsin. 400 miles west, his sister Caroline has finally stopped moving. De Smet, Dakota Territory, the little town the railroad made, the town her family helped found, holds her now. Charles has a homestead and a town lot. Mary is away at the college for the blind in Iowa, paid for out of the family's hide, and a sharp-eyed 16-year-old named Laura is about to take a teaching certificate to help keep her there. The two halves of this story, the books you know and the outlaw you didn't, have been running on parallel tracks for 40 years. In the week before Christmas, 1883, a freight car rolls into De Smet, and the tracks finally cross. The De Smet leader gave the moment exactly one sentence. December 22nd, 1883. Mr. T.L. Quiner of Fountain City, Wisconsin, arrived in De Smet this week with a carload of lumber, with which he proposes to build a store. That's it. That's how the frontier press announced the reunion of Caroline Ingalls and the baby brother she had once described as just as good a boy as ever. A man she had watched grow up through hungry winters, a man who had since walked into the Black Hills ahead of the entire United States and walked back out again. A carload of lumber, a proposed store, 4 column inches below the hog prices. But notice what that little sentence is actually telling us, because it kills the prettiest version of this story before we can fall for it. Tom didn't ride into De Smet on a whim of homesickness. He came on business, and he came heavy. A carload of lumber in a Dakota boomtown in 1883 was inventory. Tom's 20 years with Laird, Norton had taught him exactly what the Dakota boom was made of. Every shanty, store, church, and depot on that bald prairie was built from Wisconsin and Minnesota pine, shipped west by men who knew the trade. His employers were scouting Kingsbury County that very season, weighing towns for a lumber yard. They'd eventually plant their operation up the line at Lake Preston, and here was their trusted foreman, arriving in his sister's town with a carload of stock and a plan. The quiet man was always working an angle. It's just that his angles were honest ones, which in this family made him exotic twice over. The record traces the visit in Land Office Inc. In March of 1884, Thomas Quiner bought lots in De Smet, residential and business both. He hired a carpenter to put up a house on one of them, and the carpenter he hired was, of course, his brother-in-law, Charles Ingalls. Pa building a house for the outlaw. By May, the paper noted the house would be occupied by someone else, and Tom, in the end, kept his life and his lumber career anchored back in Wisconsin. The De Smet store never happened. The visit, the lots, the house, a door tested and gently closed again, which would make the whole episode a footnote, except for one evening. We don't know the exact date. We know the scene because a girl who was at the table spent her whole later life unable to forget it, and when she finally wrote it down, she gave it a chapter of its own. The sitting room behind Pa's store building, winter dark outside. This is the season of Laura's teaching contracts and Almanzo's cutter rides. She's 17, being courted, half out of the nest already. The lamp is lit. The family gathers around the visiting uncle, the way families gathered around any traveller then, because a guest was the only theatre a prairie town had. And Pa, sociable, starved for man talk, keeps his brother-in-law going on the lumber camps, the log drives, the roaring rivers, the wild, burly men of the pineries. It's good material. Tom obliges, in that level voice of his. And then Pa, making easy conversation, lobs the little question that has been waiting 40 minutes of this video to land. So, this is your first trip west? Oh, no, says the small quiet man by the lamp. I was with the first white men that ever laid eyes on the Black Hills. Feel the temperature of the room change. Laura certainly did. 60 years later she could still feel it, because when she rebuilt that evening in these happy golden years, she gave Uncle Tom the floor the way nobody ever gave it to him in life, and let him talk for pages, and the details she put in his mouth track the documented record with eerie fidelity. Listen to her, Tom. We started out from Sioux City 8 years ago, in October of 74. 26 of us men, and one man brought along his wife and their 9-year-old boy. 26 men. The wife, the 9-year-old. October of 74, out of Sioux City. Cross-check every figure against Captain Mix's reports and Annie Tallent's memoir. And the old woman writing from memory in the 1940s lands her numbers nearly dead centre. She remembered the stockade, the gold, the soldiers coming. She even kept the detail that the party went out under escort rather than in irons. Laura kept the facts. What she did was change their costume. Because here's what a reader of these happy golden years comes away with: a wonderful fireside yarn. Brave men, a daring journey, a stockade in the snowy hills, gold in the creek, and then, what a shame, what an adventure, the soldiers marched them out. The chapter is called Springtime. It sits in the book between a sewing project and a sleigh ride. It is the single most dangerous story anyone in the Little House universe ever tells, and it is dressed as an anecdote. What's missing is everything the costume hides. Missing the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the signed word of the United States, which made every step of Uncle Tom's adventure a federal crime against a nation the family's own books treat mostly as a frightening weather pattern. Missing Sheridan's burn and arrest order, the actual hazard those 26 men were gambling under. Missing what the adventure set loose. That the cheerful stockade tale Laura's readers smile through was a load-bearing event in the chain that ran straight to the Little Bighorn, to sell or starve, to the taking of Paha Sapa. Custer is not in the chapter. The Lakota are barely in the chapter. The bill is nowhere in the chapter. And one more thing is missing, smaller and stranger. Even the boast itself is a costume. The first white men that ever laid eyes on the Black Hills. It's a grand sentence, and it isn't so. French trappers had seen the hills generations before. Custer's 1,000 had marched through with a brass band the previous summer, and the hills had been looked at, lived in, named, prayed over, and buried in for centuries by the people who actually held title. What Tom's party could truly claim was narrower and darker. First civilian outfit to defy the army in, first to winter there in defiance of the treaty. First white men to lay eyes on it, is what that claim sounds like after 8 years of polishing at supper tables. Now, be fair to Laura and be fair to Tom, because the easy version of this critique is a cheap one. Tom Quiner, by every trace he left, was no monster. He was a broke logger in a collapsed economy who chased the one door out that 1874 appeared to open. And unlike the railroads, the commissioners, and the Congress, he never pretended to be doing the Lakota a favour while he did it. And Laura was a 17-year-old listening to her uncle by lamplight, who grew into a writer building books for children out of the warm parts of a cold childhood. These happy golden years went to press in 1943, when she was 76. You do not hand the machinery of the Great Sioux War to fourth graders in Chapter 13 of a love story. But that's exactly why this one evening matters more than almost any other scene in the books, because you can watch the family craft being practiced, live in a single room. We've spent whole nights on this channel tracing how the Ingalls women turned disaster respectable. The unpaid rent at Burr Oak that vanished from the books, the dead baby brother, the depression years sanded smooth. It was how that family, how most families, survived their own memories. Take the dangerous thing. Keep the facts mostly. Change the costume. Pass it down the table. What you're watching in Chapter 13 of These Happy Golden Years is where Laura learned it. Tom did it first, out loud, with the United States Army and the Sioux Nation sitting invisibly at the table, and a 17-year-old at the lamp took the lesson all the way to the bank. And think about when that chapter finally reached the world. These Happy Golden Years came out in 1943, into an America at war, rationed and frightened and starved for stories about its own sturdiness. Laura was 76, finishing the series with her daughter Rose's editorial hand somewhere in the machinery, the way it always was. To those readers, Uncle Tom's tale read as pure tonic, grit, daring, the taming of the wild. Not one reviewer in 1943 was going to pause over the legality of an 1874 gold camp. Nobody questioned the chapter, because the country that received it was still running the same costume shop. The supper ended, the visit ended. Tom tested the West one last time with those town lots, then folded his hand and went home to Lily and the Pines. The only man in this entire saga who looked at Dakota in a boom year and decided calmly that he had already had his adventure. He had about 19 years left. The books were done with him. The water wasn't. Fountain City, Wisconsin sits pressed between river bluffs on the east bank of the Mississippi, a steamboat and sawlog town. Tidy, German, vertical. That's where the Quiners made their life after Dakota. Tom rising through the laird, Norton operation. Lily keeping a house that slowly filled. Lily and Josephine in 1887. Dugald in 1889. School fees, church pews, a foreman's wages banked. For 16 years, nothing happens that history would bother writing down. Let me be honest with you about that, the way the books never quite are. Those 16 quiet years were the prize. That was the jackpot Tom Quiner actually won. Not the Creek gold, but this. A warm kitchen, children who got to grow up, an employer who trusted him, a town where nobody needed to know he'd once been the kind of man cavalry rode after. The Quiner children of the 1850s had eaten scarcity for breakfast. Tom's children never would. But while the family stood still, the forest was disappearing. This is the part of the lumber story nobody tells children. The white pine of Wisconsin, the inexhaustible cathedral-tall pinery Tom had worked since the war, was not inexhaustible. By the 1890s, the great Chippewa drives were thinning year on year. The companies had cut their way through the heart of it in a single human lifetime. Mill towns that had roared for 40 years began to go quiet. The industry that built Chicago was eating the last of its own pantry, and the men who ran it, the Lairds and Nortons and their partners up and down the upper Mississippi, were already looking at the map the way hungry industries do. The map said, West, the far, wet, green West, Oregon, Washington, where the Douglas firs stood taller than anything Wisconsin had ever grown. In 1900, the Winona and St. Paul lumber families helped bankroll one of the biggest land deals in American history, the Weyerhaeuser Purchase, hundreds of thousands of acres of Pacific Northwest timber, bought from a railroad in a single stroke. The entire industry picked itself up by the roots and moved 2,000 miles. And Tom Quiner, 55 years old with a new baby in the house, little John, born that very spring of 1900, packed his family and moved with it. Think about who else in this story that sounds like, and feel the floor tilt a little. A Quiner, no longer young, hauling a wife and children across the continent toward the next big opening. It's Pa. It's Charles Ingalls' move, made by the careful brother-in-law 20 years late. The man who declined the Dakota boom at 39 took the Oregon boom at 55. Maybe the arithmetic was just better. Maybe the pinery dying under his feet left him no Wisconsin to stay loyal to. Maybe, and I'll only say this once, a man who has wintered in the Black Hills carries a compass needle in him that never entirely stops trembling toward open country. They settled in Eugene, Oregon. Tom took charge of a logging crew, a foreman again, grey now, bossing a new generation of fellas among trees so big the Wisconsin men must have laughed out loud the first week. The family story had found its safe harbour at last, steady wages on a brand new frontier, with none of the old frontier's hunger. He got not quite 3 years of it. February 23rd, 1903. The Columbia River, the great cold artery of the Northwest timber trade, where the log rafts ran down to the mills. The record gives us the event in a single spare line, the way the records of working men's deaths always do. There was an accident on the river, and Thomas Quiner died of it. That's all. No detail survives, whether it was the logs, the water, the cold, or all three at once, the way river work usually killed. 58 years old, a wife at home, and the youngest, John, not yet 3. Almost exactly the age Tom had been when the news came up the track from Lake Michigan in 1845. Stand back and look at the whole shape of it now, because we promised at the top of tonight that this story begins with water and ends with water, and I don't think the shape is an accident so much as an occupation. The lake took Henry Quiner, the trader, in 1845. The war took Joseph at a place the army itself named for a steamboat landing on the Tennessee, and the river took Tom, the boy who'd answered all that early drowning and dying by going to work, his entire life, on moving water and frozen water, daring it season after season for 50 years like a man paying down a debt he never once mentioned. The Black Hills couldn't kill him. The United States cavalry never touched him. The Badlands, the blizzards, the Lakota winter, the log drives of 3 states, every spectacular death this continent offered, he politely declined. The water was patient. The water had the oldest claim. Think of how the news travelled. because the family had a geography by then that no single funeral could gather. A telegram or a black-bordered letter going east from Eugene, Lily writing to Wisconsin, to the Quiner kin around Eau Claire and Fountain City, and someone, a sister, a niece, writing on to Smet, South Dakota, where Caroline Ingalls, herself a widow 9 months by then, Charles dead just the previous June, opened an envelope in the house on 3rd Street and learned that the Lake's last debt had been collected. Her baby brother, the one she'd written about at 16, just as good a boy as ever, gone the way their father went on working water, far from everyone. She had buried a husband only months before. Now there wasn't even a grave near enough to stand beside. Whatever Caroline did with that letter, she did it the way she did everything, privately, without a recorded word. Her daughter, by then a farm wife in Missouri who hadn't begun to write anything at all, was 36. The chapter with Uncle Tom's voice in it was 40 years away. They buried him in Pioneer Memorial Cemetery in Eugene. Pioneer, the stone might as well say twice. Lily did what Quiner widows did because she had married into a family where the script was already written. She stayed, she worked. A milliner, hats and trimmings. A needle trade like Caroline's before her, and she raised the children alone. 16 years later she married again, a lumberman named Fuller. The trade never let go of that family, and here the record hands us one last coincidence, quiet as everything else in this man's life. Caroline Quiner-Ingalls, Ma, the careful sister, had outlived her Charles by more than 2 decades. Holding the house on 3rd Street that this channel has spent whole nights inside. She died in Smet on April 20th, 1924. Lily Quiner Fuller died in Eugene on April 26th, 1924, 6 days apart. The sister who remembered their father and the widow of the brother who couldn't, 1,500 miles between them, gone in the same week of the same April, each buried beside her own quiet half of this story. The braid that started on the Oconomowoc in the 1850s came apart all at once, in one spring, and nobody in either town had any reason to notice. The books were long done with all of them. These happy golden years were still 19 years from print, which leaves only the land itself, and the bill. The stockade is still there, sort of. Drive into Custer State Park today, off Highway 16 east of the town of Custer, South Dakota, and you can walk through a square of pine palisade on French Creek with your kids and an ice cream. Gordon Stockade, the signs say, with a tidy historical marker and a parking lot. Families picnic inside the walls. It's lovely. It is also, in the way of such places, a copy of a copy of a copy. The original, Tom's original, the one raised by frozen hands in 3 winter weeks, started dying the moment the cavalry escort dropped over the ridge in April of 1875. Looters stripped it inside months. A government survey party that summer found the walls standing and the insides gutted. The army moved in for a while and used the outlaws' fort as a barracks. And in the autumn of 1876, after the fight at Slim Buttes, General Crook's column staggered down out of the north at the end of a starvation march, scarecrow men eating their own horses, and it was Tom Quiner's stockade where they finally found food and rest. The walls the trespassers built ended up sheltering the very army sent to burn them. The frontier never met an irony it wouldn't use twice. Then the gold played out southward, Deadwood pulled the crowds north, and the fort just sat. By the 1920s it was post stubs and hearthstones in the grass, so they rebuilt it in 1925 for the tourists. It rotted. The CCC rebuilt it again in 1941. It rotted. In 2004, they tore the whole thing down and rebuilt it once more. $500,000 of grant money for a replica of a crime scene. 3 reconstructions. Because the thing itself refuses to stay standing, and the story refuses to lie down. One genuine artifact does survive, and I want you to picture it, because it's the only time in this whole night you get to actually see Tom Quiner. There is a photograph of the Gordon party, the men posed in a row, frontier stiff, facing the camera. And there at the end of the row on the left stands a noticeably short man in a light-coloured hat, holding a pistol for the photographer. That's him. That's the whole image library of Uncle Tom, one frame, one hat, one borrowed-looking pistol, one expression you can read any way you like. The man Laura describes as small and gentle-voiced, dressed up as an outlaw for the only camera that ever cared, looking honestly a little like a clerk who's wandered into someone else's legend. Which is, give or take, exactly what he was. Now follow the gold, because the gold tells you who actually won. The home stake, the claim George Hearst picked up in '77 for $70,000, ran for 125 years. 40 million ounces, give or take, out of one hole in Paha, Sapa, one of the richest gold mines the Western Hemisphere has ever seen. The bedrock of the Hearst newspapers, the Hearst castle, the Hearst everything. It finally closed in 2002, not because the hills were empty, but because the price math quit working, and then physics moved in. Today the home stakes shafts, nearly a mile down, house a laboratory, tanks and detectors in the dark of Hearst's old workings, where scientists wait for neutrinos and hunt for dark matter in the deepest, quiet money ever dug. From sacred mountain to mine, to a basement where humanity listens for the universe. That's the Black Hills in one sentence, except the sentence is missing its subject. Because through all of it, the rushes, the railroads, deadwood saloons, the homestake dividends, the tourist stockades, one fact never changed. The Lakota never sold. They said so in 1875, when the commissioners came with $6 million and went home embarrassed. They said so after Sell or Starve, when the signatures Congress waved around amounted to a fraction of what its own treaty required. And in 1923, they finally said so in the white man's own arena, a formal claim, filed in the Court of Claims: the Black Hills were taken from us unlawfully, and we want them back. That case crawled through the federal courts for 57 years, most of a century, motion by motion, long enough for every member of the Gordon Party to die, for Laura to write the books and die in her turn, for the stockade to be rebuilt twice. And as the case ground on, the judges who actually read the record began saying things judges almost never say. The Court of Claims, surveying 100 years of paper, the 1868 treaty, the unenforced orders, the quiet November meeting, the starved-out signatures, put its conclusion in one sentence that deserves to be read aloud in every classroom in this country. A more ripe and rank case of dishonourable dealings will never in all probability be found in our history. Ripe and rank. From the government's own bench, about the government's own conduct. And on June 30th, 1980, 105 years, nearly to the season, after Captain Mix's troopers emptied Fort Defiance, the Supreme Court of the United States agreed, 8 votes to 1. United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians. The seizure of the Black Hills in 1877, the court held, was not a treaty, not a purchase, not policy. It was a taking under the Fifth Amendment. The government had taken private property without just compensation, and the bill was due. The award, $17.1 million, the appraised 1877 value of the hills, plus a century of interest. Call it $106 million. At the time, the largest judgment the United States had ever been ordered to pay an indigenous nation. The money was appropriated. It sits to this day in trust accounts at the Treasury. The Lakota have never taken 1 cent. Understand the trap in it, because it's the same trap as 1876 wearing kinder paperwork. Under the law, accepting the compensation completes the sale. Touch the money, and the claim to the land is extinguished, forever, with a receipt. So the answer from the tribes, across now more than 4 decades, through poverty that ranks among the deepest in the nation, has not wavered. The Black Hills are not for sale, and the fund, refused, just keeps compounding. Past $1 billion, toward and beyond $2 billion by recent reckonings, growing in the dark like something at the bottom of a mine shaft. There is no other number like it in America. A $2 billion account whose entire meaning is that nobody will touch it. So, when I told you at the top of tonight that the bill for Tom Quiner's winter is still on the table, that wasn't a figure of speech. It is a literal line item in the United States Treasury. The wagons rolled in 1874. The invoice is still open in 2026. One more thing belongs in this chapter, and it's about how tonight's story reached you at all. For most of a century, Uncle Tom existed only as Laura's chapter, unverifiable, possibly embroidered, the kind of family tale researchers learned to distrust. Then the slow work began. Historians pulled Captain Mix's 1875 report out of the archives. Annie Tallent's and David Aiken's books were set against it, line by line. And the researchers of the Pioneer Girl Project, the scholars who spent years annotating Laura's raw, unpublished memoir for its eventual release in 2014, when it shocked everyone by becoming a bestseller 70 years after the children's books, ran down the Quiner records themselves. The land deeds, the marriage register at Winona, the De Smet leader notices, the Oregon papers. Every checkable detail in the quiet man's supper table story checked out. The party roster from 1874 sits in the histories now, and there he is among the miners and the McDonalds, plain as a tax record. Thomas Quiner of Wisconsin. The teller of the family's one true outlaw tale turned out to be its most accurate witness. Laura softened the meaning. She never had to invent the facts. In this family, that distinction is practically a love language. Come back to the supper table now. We can finally sit at it properly. De Smet, the winter dark of 1883 going into 84. The lamp, the family. Pa fiddling with conversation, Ma's needles going, a 17-year-old at the edge of the light, and the small visiting uncle answering the polite question with the sentence nobody saw coming. Oh no, I was with the first white men that ever laid eyes on the Black Hills. At the start of tonight I told you that you think you know everyone in the Little House books, and that this man gets one evening in thousands of pages. Now you know what was actually sitting at that table, inside the quietest body in the room. A baby the lake made fatherless. A boy who watched Shiloh empty his house. A logger who turned cold competence into the only security his family had ever owned. And then bet all of it, in the worst year of the century, on 6 wagons, a painted lie, and an order that promised fire. A man hunted across the map by his own country's cavalry, betrayed by his own messmates' brass buttons, marched 400 miles under escort, who then went home, hung up the story like a work coat and spent 30 years being gentle. The army never got his wagons. Think about that, against everything else tonight. Sheridan's order burned other men's outfits. The Badlands took Aaron's. The war took the headlines. The hills took everything from the people who actually owned them. The quiet man slipped through it all untouched, and the only 2 powers that ever laid a hand on Tom Quiner were the water, which had held the family's oldest debt since 1845 and collected it on the Columbia in 1903, and a girl at a Lamplight table who took the one treasure he carried out of the Black Hills and spent it better than gold. Because that's the last accounting of the Gordon party, and it's the strangest one. Whitney wanted his 150,000 and never saw it. Gordon wanted an empire of wagons and got a bonfire. Hearst, who never froze a single night on French Creek, got the 40 million ounces. And Tom Quiner's claim, the only claim from Fort Defiance that ever actually paid out down the generations, turned out to be a story. 1 chapter's worth. Laura set it in springtime, scrubbed the treaty off it, warmed it by the lamp and slipped it into a children's book in 1943, where it has been read by now by more human beings than ever held a pan in the Black Hills gold rush. That's where the crime went, friends. That's where it's been your whole life. Not denied, not confessed, tucked in, between a sewing project and a sleigh ride told in a level voice, polished the way that family polished everything, until a federal offence against a sovereign nation could be read aloud to a sleepy child without one bad dream. The books did to Uncle Tom's winter exactly what the country did to the Black Hills, kept the gold, softened the taking, and called it springtime. The swan skin is still the softest thing in those books. It came from Pa's gun, off sacred water, wrapped around the outlaw's baby daughter. The stockade is a picnic ground. The mine is a laboratory, listening for ghosts a mile under the mountain. The $2 billion is still in the account tonight. Compounding refused. The only apology America ever wrote that nobody will cash. And the quiet man is in Eugene, Oregon, under a stone that says Pioneer, with 1 photograph, 1 chapter, and 1 sentence at a supper table to show for the strangest winter, any member of that famous family ever lived. You were told the little house book showed you everything. They showed you the lamp. Tonight you saw what was sitting just past the light. Good night.